Hi again, and welcome back to HiiQ Adobe XD. We're continuing from the last episode where we just learned about artboards, and now we're going to cover the shape tools and actually drawing in Adobe XD. So I'm starting this from fresh again, where I'm going to just go to the artboard for a standard web layout. And then I'm going to select this artboard, and just for the sake of consistency, I'm going to rename it, and I'll call this my home page. And now we're going to start right away with drawing shapes. So over on the left, you should see the shape tools. So there's a few of them here. We're going to start at the top with the rectangle tool. You can also select this with R on the keyboard. So I'm just going to click and drag on my artboard here to start drawing my shape. Now, if you're used to any other Adobe programs or pretty much any other design program, you should be familiar with some key modifiers that you can use while drawing a shape. So those key modifiers are, I can hold Shift, and that will keep the shape constrained to a perfect square or perfect circle if I'm using the Ellipse tool. I can hold the Alt key, and this will start drawing the shape from the center of where I initially clicked. So to do that one more time, I start my click, and it's dragging from left to right. But then if I hold Alt, it drags from the center. I can combine that with the Shift key to drag from the center and keep the shape constrained. Perfect. So I'll just draw a basic shape like so. And now with the shape created, I get a few options right off the bat. I can select any of these handles to actually click and drag and resize the shape. If I hover just above the shape and wait till my cursor changes to this little option to rotate, I can rotate the shape around. I can hold Shift to constrain it to intervals of about 15 degrees. And also, within the shape, there's these 4 little handles here that allow me to control the shape's actual radius. So if I click and drag on one, it'll change the radius of all 4 corners, giving them a nice rounded corner edge. If you just want to do this to one of them, you can hold down the Option or Alt key, and you'll see that you can just drag one to create a sort of tab look. I'm going to drag all of them a little bit. There we go. Now all of these settings can be mathematically set over on the right in your Properties panel. So where I have at the top here, as long as the shape is selected, if not, go back to your Select tool, which is the first tool in your toolbar, or V on the keyboard, and make sure your shape is selected. With the shape selected, I have my standard width and height controls, the position from X and Y, which is starting from the top left, X across, Y down, as well as the rotation. There's also an option for fixed position when scrolling. We'll look more at these options as we create some bigger layouts later on. As I said in the previous episode, we're going to be covering responsive resize at a later time, so for now, I'm just going to turn this off. Now, some of the most important settings would be your actual appearance settings. So just going down the list, we have our standard opacity setting. So I can make the shape more opaque. We have the actual radius setting. So I can set the radius for all sides. So I'll just make all sides a straight 20. Or if I click this option here, it allows me to change it on an individual side basis. So with these 4 options, it starts in the top left, top right, bottom left. Just like before when we were talking about the margins of our artboards, it's always clockwise, starting from the top. Then we have our fill options. So I'm going to give this a nice blue color here. And if I'm going to reuse this blue later on, I want to add this as a standard swatch. So now that I've picked my blue, I'm just going to click on the little plus option here to save that swatch for later. Okay. The border, I can click to have no border, or I'm just going to select a different color. I'm just going to make it a solid black here. And below that, I can increase my border size, so I can type in the number, or, just as before, use the arrow keys to adjust the size. You can also get really fancy and add dashes, as well as change the gap of those dashes. Now, for the sake of design, I am just going to set that to 0 and have no dash. You can then also set where the actual border sits on the shape. So right now it's on the inside of the shape. If I want it on the outside, I can just click this button here. Note that that's going to increase the actual height and width of the shape if you are giving this off to a designer that needs very exact measurements. I can also set this to be the center of the shape. Now, just for the sake of our projects, we like to typically keep all of the borders on the inside of the shape. Now, if there was any kind of break in the shape, I can also change the gap between that break. And if it had corners on it, I can change how that corner looks. Now, for these actual options, these are great for design, especially if you're a Photoshop user or Illustrator user. But when it comes to designing something for web, I typically avoid some of these options just to keep it really easy for the developer, as these are not standard options in terms of web development coding. Now, there's also a nice little option here for a shadow, so I'm going to check that on. And what it allows me to do is I can select a color for my shadow, as well as an opacity. I'm just going to raise that up so it's more apparent. And then here I just need to select the X and Y coordinates. So the X is where the shadow sits horizontally. So if I increase that, you can see the shadow come out from behind on the right. And if I put in the negatives, it'll come into the left. And then the Y, I can shift it down. The blur allows me to change, well, how much the actual shadow blurs. What's great about these settings as opposed to Photoshop's standard drop shadow is that this is exactly what a web developer would enter in when they're creating drop shadows in a website. So it's much better than, say, Photoshop's little global radius option, as that one's much harder to try and calculate for your web developer. Now, background blur, we're going to be getting into a little bit later. This will create some really fancy effects that are available in devices such as iOS and Android. So that's the basics of the standard shape tool. Now, we also have the ability to create an ellipse using the Ellipse tool here. So I can click on that, click and drag, and just as before, I can hold Shift to make sure it stays as a perfect circle, and I can combine that with Option or Alt so that it will create from the center. I'll just draw a standard circle here. And there we go. I can go and fill it in with all my standard options. So I can go into the fill, and I can select that same swatch as before. Perfect. Now, it's probably a good idea to keep your shapes named, specifically based on what they are. So over in the Layers panel on the left here, I can rename this rectangle and just call it a button background, for instance. And then my ellipse, well, it is just still an ellipse. What I can do also here is I can hide any of these shapes. If I'm working with lots of shapes, it's usually a good idea to be able to hide or unhide shapes as needed. I can also lock them by clicking the little lock here in the Layers panel, and this just makes sure that if I'm on my Move tool, I cannot move or edit this shape until I unlock it. This is good when you have lots of shapes on the screen and you have to click around a lot. Just want to make sure that I don't accidentally click the wrong shape and move it out of the perfect position I had it in before. Now, after the Ellipse tool, there's also the Line tool. So the Line tool, self-explanatory, just creates a very simple border line. So as you're drawing one of these lines, you can hold Shift to keep the line on a perfect 45-degree angle. And you can also hold Option to draw it from the center. And there we go. After I've drawn it, I can still resize it at any point. And over in the Options panel, I have all the same options save for a fill. So I can just give this line a nice border thickness. Perfect. So those are the basic shape tools within Adobe XD. Next episode, we're going to go into the more advanced shape tool, the Pen tool, and all of its little fancy hotkeys. Till next time. HiiQ is filmed in Hiilite Creative Group Studio in Kelowna, British Columbia, and is made with the help of our creative team. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel and check us out at hiilite.com.